Welcome to the screencast for Non-Contractual Society, A Feminist View by Virginia Held. You can find this article on page 550 in your textbook. So I've been alluding to social contract theory a lot in recent lectures, so now we're going to get the details. In 1651, Thomas Hobbes, who was an English philosopher, published a massive book called The Leviathan. It was a work about political philosophy. So he outlined in it what he thought was the only basis a government could have to legitimately have power over people. Remember, I told you that before social contract theory, nothing like this was in place. Human rights weren't really a concept that people back then would have understood, at least not in the sense that we understand them. When the Western philosophers started to develop classical liberalism, which remember is rooted in individual liberty, it was the first time in history, really, that these kinds of considerations were put into the actual practice of forming governments. So governments can have illegitimate power, where they seize it by force, maintain it by force. It might be autocratic or tyrannical, or a monarchy. It could actually even be democratic. The question of why government has any legitimate power over us at all is a topic that is still debated and argued about. But the Western world has come to more or less of a consensus view in which the governed people are what give the government legitimacy. So that's what you might be familiar with the phrase consent of the governed. And Hobbes gave us the philosopher's favorite thought experiment of an idealized pre-government state. So before any government is formed. Now, this probably never existed on the planet with human beings. But we can imagine a society in which everybody rules over just themselves. So that means every single person has absolute power over their own bodily autonomy and choices, and absolute freedom to do whatever they want. There are no laws that stop them. So you have complete self-sovereignty. The problem here, of course, is that everyone has this absolute freedom. So you can imagine trying to amass wealth or resources for yourself and your family, and someone comes by and steals it or kills you and takes it. No matter how strong you are, no matter how smart you are, you're just one person. So there's no possible way that you can defeat all possible threats. And this is Hobbes' state of war of all against all, if you've ever heard that. He's also the guy that famously said, life is nasty, brutish, and short. He meant this state of nature, pre-government, where everybody has absolute freedom. Life, it would indeed be for everyone nasty, brutish, and short. People would take whatever they wanted with violence. You would have a hard time meeting your basic needs, and it would be hard to avoid death. So, since we're all rational people, and that's one of the underlying assumptions or beliefs under almost all of Western thought, we're all rational and we're all self-interested. And if you're rational, you can reason out that if we didn't have a government, it will be in this state of war of all against all. You want to end that state if you're a reasonable person. You want a stable life where you can get land and resources and take care of yourself and your family. So you will give up some of your absolute freedom and self-sovereignty in exchange for the government to protect you, to have a system of laws where people can no longer just seize whatever they want through violence or threats or intimidation. That means everybody can flourish to the best of their abilities and luck. So since Hobbes in the 1600s, nearly every major political and social theory in the West has had the social contract as an implicit or explicit implied premise. The subjects of these theories are all self-contained, rational, and self-interested parties. They're the base unit upon which we theorize. The selfish actors are all individual egoists who will try to further their desires and needs to the detriment of all else. So as far as you can under the rule of law, you're going to advocate for your own interests. And any sort of community level welfare is going to be a byproduct of all of these individual actors pushing their own self-interests. That's what happens when you think that the base unit of society is the individual. So equality and regulation will always be a force that directly opposes these individuals advocating for their own rights. And that's sort of the essence of the social contract theory. Of course, there's lots of details that I left out, but it's enough to know that Held, in this article, will propose a different kind of theory, a non-contractual society. We've already read Virginia Held when we looked at the ethics of care, and that this theory will actually underlie a lot of the arguments in this article. So the basic relationship in social contract theory consists of two or more well-informed, rationally self-interested parties mutually agreeing on a contract. Both are compensated fairly, and neither of them care about the other one's interests. The government or authority enforces laws to keep transactions fair. But Held notes that not all human relationships are contractual like this. And she takes the mother-child relationship as a paradigm or an example or a stand-in for the absolute furthest you can get away from this traditional contractual view. It's almost directly opposite to the contractual view. And when she says the mother-child relationship, she means an idealized version of the mother-child relationship, not any specifics. She means the idealized idea of someone mothering a child who is dependent upon them. That's why she says mothering person can be male or female, because anytime you take responsibility for a child's life or any sort of dependent, and you are responsible for their life and well-being, and they look to you for protection and guidance, that's sort of the ideal version of what the bond between a mother and child is. Just like so-called economic man is the idealized version in the contract theory, which just means you're a purely rational, self-interested person. So those are the two opposite idealized roles. Remember how I said that Western theory takes the individual as the base unit that you theorize upon. Held is going to take the mother-child relationship as the base unit to theorize upon. So the world of the contract is often called the public sphere, and family is often called the private sphere. So when women in America particularly, but in most of the Western world, fought to have equal rights under the law in the 19th and 20th centuries, they were trying to participate in this so-called public sector. But now some theorists are starting to wonder if some of the values from the private sector wouldn't benefit people in public transactions. So to aim at that end, she looks at what might change if we developed a political system with the relationship of the mother-child in the center instead of the contract and the self-interested, rational individual. So this is an overview of the differences between the two base units of theorizing. When you enter into a contract, it is voluntary, it's temporary, it's replaceable. All parties involved are equal under the law. You fulfill your obligations to the other parties in the contract by not interfering with their rights, and of course doing whatever the terms of the contract are. All of the parties are entitled to privacy. You can't make demands on their time or resources other than what's specified in the contract. And all parties are supposed to have equal power. Whereas if you're focused on the mother-child relationship, It's non-voluntary. It's permanent. It's not replaceable. The parties are not equal under the law or under consideration. Don't worry, we're going to go into more detail about it in just a minute. It's necessary to interfere with each other's lives to provide what the child needs. Parties are not entitled to privacy, and there is unequal power. So what does she mean when she says voluntary versus non-voluntary? Contracts are voluntary agreements that all participants agree to. Now, in the social contract, it's an implicit agreement. It's thought to be theoretically agreed to abstractly. Of course, when we choose to participate in a concrete contract, everyone volunteers to join. And now, somebody might choose to become a mother or a mothering person, but there are a few things about the relationship that are non-voluntary. Once you become a mother, it's not voluntary anymore to participate. Moreover, you cannot pick the child you end up with. You don't know what sort of demands they're going to place on your time, what sort of personalities they're going to have, what sort of resources they're going to need from you. And of course, children can't choose their parents. In a contract, all parties know exactly what's being exchanged. That's the difference. You don't know what child you're going to get. Children can't pick their parents. Since in a contract you know what's being exchanged, you can back out at any time, and mothering is not like that. Held notes that societies and the rule of law do impose rules on parenting, but they're of a vastly different nature than the rules that are in place in a contract. And a lot of times those rules on parenting only come into play as apart from the ideal mother-child relationship when resources are scarce. She says on page 553, the emotional satisfaction of a mothering person is a satisfaction in the health of the relation between the two persons, not the gain that results from an egoistic bargain. The motive behind the activity of mothering is thus entirely different from what behind a market transaction. Excuse me for that flub. Okay, so that's on page 553. The second thing in that chart where the contractual theory, everything's temporary, everything's replaceable, while in the mother-child relationship, it's permanent and non-replaceable. All formal contracts are for a specified duration, they're not forever. The parties interact only during that time, and if the contract fails for whatever reason, you can just go find somebody else to do the good, service, or labor that you wanted from the first person. Everything becomes a commodity. Everything is replaceable. Nothing is unique or special. And that is everything from consumer goods to sex work. There's nothing that is commodification in the mother-child relationship. It's for the duration of the entire life of both parties. Even if one of them dies, the other is still going to remember that person. The individual in that mother-child relationship is non-replaceable, and whatever it is that makes them unique is integral to that relationship. So while we go through these 6 things, I want you to think, if we treated people in the public sphere more like this relationship. Now, of course, Held knows that you're not going to have the feeling and attachment that you do for a child when you interact with people at work or potential clients. But she does think that if this were in the background, if care and concern for the other parties were a higher priority, if the particular people that you have a business relationship were treated as less replaceable, that may indeed change the face of how public society is shaped. Unequal parties versus equal parties. This is the third way in which mother-child relationships differ to contractual relationships. In contracts, parties are theoretically both on the same level of power. Of course, in real life, that's not really true. There's always inequalities of wealth, of intelligence and information about other people's tactics or strategies. There's differences in legal status and experience. There's tons of metrics that make people unequal. But people are equally protected under the law, at least ideally. In the mother-child relationship, power is never equal, and neither is intelligence or experience. The mothering person must use their intelligence and experience to protect the child in the relationship, and the mother makes most of the important decisions regarding both parties. So this time, equality isn't about rights. It's not individual rights under the law that matter for equality. It's equal consideration. So before any decision is made, we give equal consideration to both the mother and the child. So there's more than one sense of equality that's important to morality and creating social norms. That's her point in this one. There are different kinds of equality depending on the status of the different people involved in the relationships. Non-interference versus interference. So this goes back to the positive rights, negative rights distinction. Remember that negative rights are the rights to be left alone or not interfered with. There's the common phrase that your right to punch ends at the tip of my nose. That is sort of a good example of what negative rights are. The right to be left alone, to do whatever you want, to shape your life the way you want to. But Helda argues that we're not all quote-unquote Robinson Crusoes. If you don't know who that is, he was the main character in a book in, I think, the 1800s. He was shipwrecked and had to build his life from scratch on an island all by himself. And he ended up building fantastic inventions from what he could find on the island. So she's using Robinson Crusoe as the idea of someone who's completely self-sufficient. And she argues that we're very rarely that independent. We all depend on one another. We're interdependent, especially when we're children or elderly or infirm or disabled. But even when we're able-bodied adults, we all depend on each other for some things. There's no real person that's a complete island unto themselves. So sometimes we need positive rights. And there's already a school in political philosophy that advocates for this in a different way. But positive rights are things like adding adequate health care, education, an adequate level of nutrition, clean water, clean environments, freedom from violence. These are positive rights that you actually have to perform actions to give to other people. And the mother-child relationship is like that. You have to actively act or interfere with your child's life and choices if you want to shape them and care for them as the mothering person. Privacy versus personal demands. In contractual theory, you don't need to know more about the parties that are involved than exactly the amount of information that will complete the contract. Otherwise, everybody deserves privacy and no further demands on the resources of the other party than what was agreed to in the contract. But most relationships in life, not just the mother-child one, but especially the mother-child one, they're not like this. In our private lives, we place demands on the time and resources of others all the time, not as a one-to-one exchange like in a contract. It's just the way human relationships are. And to be a mother is to be like this in a very demanding way. The entirety of our child's well-being is at stake. You have to shape that child in numerous ways for them to be successful adults. You have to shape them educationally, morally, socially, financially. The demands on her time and resources are extreme. So those are quite different. Privacy and no further demands on time and resources versus time and resource demands plus a massive amount of responsibility in helping other people. Okay, is this the last one? It might be yeah, it's the sixth and last one. How power is used. So when you're in the so-called public sphere of the world of social contracts, power is very desirable so you can win. You can shape the contract to the best terms to further your interests more. Remember, you're this rationally self-interested person that is not concerned with the interests of the other parties. The power you have as a mother or a parent is vastly different. It's used to shape your child's personality and life and encourage growth. Maybe not personality, but encourage their growth and shape their behavior. You don't wield power to bend other people to your will. You use it gently because it's coming out of a place of care. Even the child has power in a certain sense, in that they're needy and they demand certain actions to thrive. So they demand this vigilant care. Now, of course, the mother is doing this out of concern for her child, out of love, but in the contract, the concern for the other party is discouraged. Okay, so these 6 ways the mother-child relationship and non-contractual theorizing is very different to the contract theorizing individual style of previous political theory. So what would happen if we applied the characteristics of the mother-child relationship to the public sphere? What would change? What could change for the better? Here's a long quote from Held on page 556 for her sort of steering as to where it might go, or why it would be important to think about these things. She says, there are good reasons to believe that a society resting on no more than bargains between self-interested or mutually disinterested individuals will not be enough to withstand the forces of egoism and dissolution pulling such societies apart. Although there may be some limited domains in which rational contracts are the appropriate form of social relations, as a foundation for the fundamental ties that ought to bind human beings together, they're clearly inadequate. Perhaps we can learn from a non-patriarchal household better than we can from further searching in the marketplace what the sources might be for justifiable trust, cooperation, and caring. So I'd like you to think about those 6 factors we talked about and imagine what sort of real-world actual policies we could put into place if they were more of the backing norms or values that we had for social organization. If we had more care and concern for the people with whom we are involved with, whether this is business, whether these are the least well-off members of society, or whether it's someone suffering a natural disaster halfway across the globe. One concrete way that people who have thought about this after Held published her article was thinking about those positive sorts of rights. Because if the relationship that we have with the poorest and least well-off in our society was more of concern and less of indifference, we might, of course, again, with the caveat that it's not ever going to be the same as the relationship between you and your actual child, but if you have the mother-child relationship as an ideal, it would help to raise the level of the quality of life for people who are the least well-off in society.